um, the best way for you to provide your feedback is through the Q&A feature. That's a button at the bottom of the, at least my bottom of my screen, and you can type your comments there. That way that is more manageable. If you do it in the chat, I will be monitoring the chat as well, but that chat might flow across the screen and you might lose it somehow. So, so far that really hasn't happened in these presentations. We haven't had too active of a chat. But you just never know. So best if you do the Q&A, but you can also use the chat if that's something that you're more familiar with. So we've got 3 presentations today on loosely related to voting rights in some ways. We have a presentation by Mara Suttman at Connecticut College on poll workers, one by Michael Ritter from Washington State University on voting equipment and residual voting and how that has inequality issues with it, and then a team from Mississippi, from both Ole Miss and from Mississippi State, that are looking at the voter experiences within the state of Mississippi. So we're going to start in that order with Mara. Won't You Be My Neighbor? Descriptive Representation in Poll Worker Performance.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right, and let me just go to, if it will let me. Sorry, there's the tab at the top that's not allowing me to go to the presenter mode. There we go, read mode. All right, can everyone see that? Good? And folks can hear me? All right, had some internet issues yesterday and hopefully that won't be the case today. Yeah, I am really excited to be sharing this work. Folks who are familiar with my research will know that I've been trying to figure out how to study poll workers, who they are, and study their performance since 2015. So the slog continues. I'm really looking forward to getting comments from Lisa. And I also want to thank Leah Merivaki, who's on this call, who helped me work through some of the methods for this paper. I'm generally a qualitative researcher, so this is a bit of a new endeavor for me. And I really appreciate her help with that. And thanks, of course, to the whole team down in Florida for putting together this virtual conference. It's been really cool to participate, and I'm really glad to be able to be here again today. So I do want to share a little bit of the motivation behind this paper and behind my research on poll workers more generally. I think there's been some really great work done by Bridget King, looking at the value of descriptive representation in polling places for the experiences of racial and ethnic minorities. I didn't see Bridget on the list of attendees, but Bridget, if you're here, please know that you've been a big inspiration for this work, and would love to get feedback from her at some point. So that's sort of the major substantive outcome I'm interested in exploring in this paper. But more broadly, this work relates to, as I mentioned, work that I'm doing trying to best figure out how we can study and understand poll workers, how we can measure their performance, how we can get a representative sense of who they are. This relates to this final point about methods for studying poll workers. And I also want to note that there's a lot of inspiration for this paper that came from a piece of qualitative research that I did that featured interviews with poll workers about their experiences and how they make decisions, that's now out in APR. So I thought it would be useful for folks to have a little bit of a background on this, since it's really been a long-term focus and interest of mine. And there's a lot of moving parts to this research that I'm looking forward to sharing. So the sort of core research questions I'm asking surround this question of descriptive representation, and specifically, does having descriptive representation in polling places improve outcomes for racial and ethnic minorities? And so for this paper, in large part because of the data that I have available, I'm looking at provisional ballot counts as an outcome of interest. But something else I'm exploring, which is where the Won't You Be My Neighbor title comes from, is if there's this relationship between neighborhood familiarity among poll workers and polling place outcomes. And Chicago is a really interesting place to study this. This is the jurisdiction that I'm looking at, because poll workers are often assigned, as I found out in some of my other research, based on neighborhood, based on where they live. And so that's something I'm trying to get at. I didn't quite get there with this paper, but I have some other ideas, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. So just to preview the jurisdiction and the data that I'm looking at, we're talking here about provisional ballot counts in the 2018 midterm elections in Chicago. And I'll talk a little bit more in a couple of slides about how I put this data set together. It was more than a bit of a slog to get these pieces of data together and compiled. But I have the start of what I hope is a really interesting sort of long-term data collection on poll workers, hopefully extending beyond Chicago. So I want to just talk a little bit about, what we know about the value of descriptive representation. Admittedly, this is a new literature area for me, so I would love any feedback from folks in the audience about other places that I need to look, specifically understanding the value of descriptive representation for different racial and ethnic minority groups. So it's of course been well established that there is bias in the provision of services and in voter experiences and perceptions in the context of election administration, at polling places, and sort of this has been established across a range of different contexts, that racial and ethnic minorities often have lower quality experiences, have poorer services. So this is not something that is new. This is something that we know quite a bit about. But of course, we have a lot of research that looks at descriptive representation. Sort of, do you have a legislator, an election administrator, a poll worker, that shares your racial or ethnic background? And there's evidence that this can improve both sort of voter perception, so perception of elections, perception or confidence in elections, confidence in election outcomes, as well as substantive outcomes like receiving a reply from a state legislator, or having a member of Congress actually advocate for you on issues that are important to your racial or ethnic group. So I do want to note, at least based on my reading of the literature, which again I'm somewhat new to, the effects of descriptive representation are less clear for the Hispanic Latinx community. A lot of work has been done looking at descriptive representation for Black communities, but that's something I think I need to spend a little more time teasing out. So where do poll workers fit into all of this? So these are the folks who are on the front lines on election day. I think that this election cycle in particular, it's going to be really interesting and possibly a little concerning to see how polling places are staffed and run in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. But in any case, these are the folks who are responsible for confirming voter eligibility, and importantly, they are that sort of first line in deciding, does a voter get a provisional ballot or do they get a standard ballot? So it's really important to note that poll workers are folks, they're temporary workers. They have limited opportunities to develop organizational processes and norms. And so, there might not necessarily be the same standards of implementation from election to election and poll worker precinct to precinct because of this. Something that I found in my research that's been really interesting is that poll workers have reported in Chicago that there are different training guidelines and law implementation even within the same jurisdiction. So just to give a brief example, I had a couple of poll workers say they were told not to issue any provisional ballots, and that I had other poll workers say they were given very, very exact standards for issuing provisional ballots depending on who did their training. And so this is something that I think needs to be teased out a little bit more as well. But it's really important to sort of better understand these individuals because we know that they shape voter experiences. We know that they shape the confidence that they have in elections. And then, drawing on the work that's been done by Bridget King, there's a particularly positive effect for racial and ethnic minority voters in terms of their confidence when they are served by poll workers who they perceive to share their racial and ethnic identity. And of course, I also want to note that there's been legal support for descriptive representation in polling places. This is a quote from a court ruling out of Alabama in the mid-1980s. The open and substantial presence of Black poll officials, according to the evidence, is a significant indication to many Black persons that voting places are now open to all, that Black persons not only have a legal right to come and vote, that they are welcome. And of course, the more Black poll officials there are, the greater confidence Black persons will have in the election process and the less fear they will have about participating in that process. And so there's this sort of real value, at least in terms of voter perception, of having descriptive representation in polling places. Again, I'm more focused on the provisional ballot outcomes in this paper, but it's really worth noting that this is something that has been recognized. So the other thing I want to touch on is this neighborhood familiarity hypothesis that I've identified and am working through. So something to note about the city of Chicago: it's highly segregated by race and ethnicity. And in my correspondence with the Chicago Board of Elections, they confirmed to me that they do their best to either assign poll workers to a precinct that they prefer, or to assign them to a precinct that is as close to home as possible. Now, there are exceptions to this, but that is sort of generally the rule of thumb that they try to follow. And then I also just want to highlight some of, or what I mean by these neighborhood familiarity effects in terms of the interviews that I have done with Chicago poll workers. Many of them reported that working in their home neighborhood, working in a neighborhood that they are familiar with, actually makes the process of confirming voter eligibility easier. They're seeing people they know, they're seeing people that they regularly interact with. So I just think there's some really interesting things to potentially explore there. So I want to make sure I touch briefly on why I'm using provisional ballots here as this outcome of interest. So provisional ballots, they have been used as a measure of jurisdiction election performance. Of course, Leah Merivaki and Dan Smith have done some really great work thinking about the implementation of provisional ballots as this question of the equal treatment under the law. And then again, there are, of course, the possibility for there to be different provisional ballot standards even within the same jurisdiction, and there's some evidence of this in Chicago. So in terms of my expectations, I expect there to be a positive effect of descriptive representation for Black voters, but not necessarily for Hispanic or Latinx voters. And again, that's drawing on some of the literature that shows there's not necessarily as clear-cut findings for descriptive representation among that group. I also examined the relationship between a lack of representation for these voters, and I expect there to be a negative effect when these voters are represented by white poll workers. And then my third hypothesis relates to the neighborhood familiarity effect. So the effect of having poll workers who have served in who serve in the same neighborhood where they live, and I do expect there to be a positive effect there. So to talk a little bit more about the data. So for a long time, I've been trying to figure out how to sample, survey, and measure poll workers. And I realized that I had the names and addresses for all of the poll workers who had served in the 2018 midterm elections as a part of another project I am working on. So I actually went ahead and requested a voter file for this group. I'll talk a little bit more about the lack of completeness in that file, which really limits some of my findings, but it was a really good start, I think, in terms of getting a better sense of who these folks are. So I'm combining this individual demographic data on poll workers who served in the 2018 midterm elections with data from the Chicago Democracy Project. So they collect precinct level data, collect and organize on a number of different important precinct level demographic outcomes. And then I was able to get data from the Chicago Board of Elections on provisional ballot counts. So the unit of analysis here is the precinct level provisional vote counts during these elections. And then I do analysis of all precincts that don't include poll worker variables, but then as I'm going to make note of here, I was only able to get a complete sense of a smaller subsample of the precincts in Chicago because of the limited voter file data. So just to give some descriptive information from the voter file data, TargetSmart was able to identify 81.6% of the names that I requested. I'm working with them to hopefully hopefully get a more complete file. But unfortunately, you know, these aren't necessarily distributed across precincts in a way that allow me to test a broad range of precincts. So the precincts for which I was able to completely identify all of the characteristics of all poll workers were less than half of the total precincts in the city that year. Fortunately, there is complete ward representation in terms of the number of precincts in each ward. But again, sort of it's a limited sample. And as I say in the paper, I'm pretty cautious about the claims that I make about my findings for this reason. But in terms of the racial makeup of the poll workers, I was able to identify somewhat on par with what the total population is in Chicago. About half of the poll workers were Black poll workers, about 32% were white, 13.9% were Hispanic, Latinx, and then 2% were Asian. So a little bit more representation there for Black residents in terms of Black poll workers overall across the city. So I used a negative binomial regression clustered by precinct, again, on the advice of Leah, who was so helpful in the process of writing this paper. And then, again, my dependent variable is the count of provisional ballots, and then I include a number of precinct-level independent variables. The ones that are going to be most important for our purposes here, there's a variable for the number of Black, white, and Hispanic poll workers in each precinct in that subsample. A variable for the number of poll workers who are also registered to vote in the same precinct, and this forms my neighborhood familiarity measure. You're assigned to vote in precincts that are in your home neighborhood in Chicago. So that's sort of, as I'm going to talk about a little later, I think that's kind of a too conservative of an estimation of this effect, but that's the data that I have right now. And then I'm also able to get data on the partisan makeup of precincts from the Target Smart Voter file. I'm happy to talk more about that. And then I also control for a range of variables that are known to affect provisional ballot counts from other research. And I'm still waiting on the addition of a few other control variables from the Chicago Democracy Project. So things might change a little bit. So I wanted to first just model provisional ballot counts across all precincts without including that poll worker data. So this is the complete sample of Chicago precincts during the 2018 midterm elections. And we see that the percentage of a Black population in a precinct is positively related to the count of provisional ballots. And then other things that might be expected as well, a relationship between movers. So if the percentage of precinct that had recently had an increase of folks moving into that precinct, and I measure this across a range of different types of moves as well. But the sort of the variables of interest here really are the interested in looking at the relationship between the percentage of racial and ethnic minorities in a given precinct and the provisional ballot counts. So something I did to get a sense of what descriptive representation actually looks like in Chicago precincts, I took a look at all of the precincts that were either majority white, majority Black, majority Hispanic, majority Asian, and then looked to see if they were also served by a majority of poll workers who shared their racial or ethnic background. And so you can see here that Black voters in Chicago, at least in this little subsample, enjoy high levels of descriptive representation. White voters, do as well. It's less so for Hispanic voters. And then the number of precincts that are majority Asian is quite small, so the descriptive representation there is a little bit more difficult to parse out. So just looking at the mean provisional ballot counts by racial and ethnic precinct majorities in this subsample, we see that there's not a huge range of variation here in sort of what the average number of provisional ballot counts are. But looking at the data more broadly, there are a number of precincts that are outliers. There's one that had like 108 provisional ballots that were cast in 2018. So looking at outliers might be something that I need to consider more closely, as I work through these data in the future. So what I want to show now is sort of the results of the full model where I'm trying to actually understand the effect of descriptive representation and this neighborhood familiarity effect. So much to my chagrin, really there's only this significant effect when you look at the relationship between the percentage of Hispanic Latinx voters in a precinct and the number of white poll workers in that precinct. And I'm gonna break those down here in just a little bit, and you can actually see that it's not significant at all levels. So there's really limited evidence there of that negative effect of non-congruent descriptive representation. The variable that I'm using to measure neighborhood familiarity, poll workers registered in a precinct, it's in the expected direction, but not statistically significant. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I think is going on here in the conclusion. I think that there's just a lot of limitations given the lack of completeness in my data set with the voter file. So if we break down the provisional counts by Hispanic population and white poll workers, I have it broken down here for precincts with no Hispanic voters. And then sort of this is the first quarter, the mean, the third quarter, and the maximum. You know, this is a variable for which you know it's got wide confidence intervals. The statistical significance goes away as the Spanish population increases. Some evidence that there is this effect of white poll worker representation or lack thereof. But again, I'm very circumspect about these claims. Let's see, oops. To wrap up here, so at least with these data, no neighborhood familiarity effects, no real sort of positive evidence of this descriptive representation effect, and this limited evidence of non-congruent representation effects for Hispanic and Latinx populations. So I think, you know, I really need to do some more work to try to get a more fully developed picture of what poll workers look like in Chicago. It's also worth noting, though, that like, at least at the data I'm looking at, we see high levels of descriptive representation for Black voters in Chicago. There really wasn't a lot of variation on that particular variable. And it may be that Chicago is just not the best place to explore this question. It happens to be the place for which I have data. And so I'm trying to think through how to work through that. I do have other measures that I'm working on constructing right now that might better get at both the neighborhood familiarity effect and other important controls. So I am able to measure the distance from poll workers' homes to precincts. It's a bit of a process, but that might be something that would better capture that neighborhood familiarity effect. And then I also have data for all of the poll workers who worked in the 2018 midterm elections. I'm able to look back and see, did they work in 2016? Did they work in 2015 local elections? So there's a lot of different things I'm going to try. But yeah, that is all I have for now. And I really look forward to getting comments from Lisa. And thank you to everyone who is here and tuning in.
Thank you very much, Mara. So next up, we have Michael Ritter from Washington State University, Residual Voting, Voting Equipment, and Inequality.
All right. Can everyone see that?
No, we cannot see a screen share from you.
Okay, never mind. How about now? Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to present my talk on residual voting, voting equipment, and inequality. A key motivation for this research is that I'm highly interested in equality rights regarding voting rights. Carolyn Tolbert and I we have a book through the Oxford University Press coming out early this fall that looks at the issue of voting equality and how convenience voting laws shape turnout equality between different racial groups and also different income groups. And I wanted to extend my motivation to engage in such research to looking at other elements of state election administration, and my attention turned to residual voting. And I'll define the term residual voting. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already. I'll touch upon the conceptual definition of residual voting here in a minute. But first, I want to introduce to all of us the importance of election machines, even in the present day. Just last month in the Georgia primary election, the Georgia election administration at the local and state levels tried to implement new election devices, ballot marking devices that were designed to optimize the voting process for Georgians, offering ballots in different languages, for instance, and also providing audio ballots for those visually impaired. Those sound like great features of an election machine that will assist individuals and enhance their likelihood of being able to cast a ballot accurately and have that ballot accepted. However, as reported in the New York Times, and as most of you are probably familiar with, these election machines were associated with a cascade of problems, and they basically caused long lines in Georgia during the primary election process, and probably lots of voting problems for Georgians. Problems associated with machines included the machines requiring too much power for polling locations, blown fuses, and never powering on. Also at issue were the fact that a number of poll workers were inadequately trained to use the polling machines, and also in a number of cases, the election machines arrived just a few days before the primary election, so there's minimal preparation time available. And so this may sound like a unique instance of election machines causing problems in the US election process, but actually this story of election machines creating an obstacle to ballot casting is not new. Election machines are a critical, they offer a linkage that is a critical input to the voting process. Among the key functions of election machines are to present voters with ballots in which to register their choices, and then managing that information contained in choices that voters make, including the counting of ballots. You must have, it leads to higher voter efficacy that they have confidence that when they cast ballots, that their ballots will be accurately counted. And I was speaking to my wife the other day. She generally takes it for granted that her vote has been accurately counted, but as we know, as political scientists, that's not always the case. And with variation in election machine quality, there is also variation in the likelihood that votes will be accurately counted. Now, in an ideal universe, election machines would be a convenient means by which voters can make their choices, and their vote intentions would be translated in every case into an actual vote choice with perfect correlation. But as the Georgia example indicates, sometimes election machines do not function perfectly with reference to these benchmarks. As most of you know, in the 2000 presidential election in Florida, millions of individuals were not able to have their ballots counted because of the hanging chat issues associated with punch card voting machines and other election administration issues. The decision on election machines is often a decision made at the state level and more commonly at the county and municipal levels. And variations in state and local decision-making, as well as differences in financial resources used to acquire these election machines, can lead to variations in quality. So I want to examine briefly the historical background on the evolution of election machine changes. Now, I make the argument that election machine advancement is driven by the need to make ballot casting easier for citizens, to protect the independence and privacy of the ballot casting process, and also to accurately record vote choices. Now, you may also throw into the mix the idea that election machine advances or changes are also driven by need and a desire among election administrators to reduce the cost of election administration. That's also true, but I'm really focusing on the voter perspective or orientation in this study. Now, according to Alvarez and Hall, there are 3 general periods of election machine dominance in US history. From the beginning of the American Republic to the late 19th century, partisan paper ballots were dominant. Around the time of the late 19th century, this is where we have the rise of the Australian ballot, basically the non-partisan ballots. And also later in the 19th century, we have the development of lever machines that were the precursors to forms of electronic voting, such as optical scanners today. And but basically, these were innovations that lasted. These modes of voting were dominant until the middle of the 20th century. Starting in the 1960s, we have the rise of electronic voting mechanisms, including punch card voting machines, optical scan machines, and direct recording electronic machines. Now, these machines, throughout these different eras, these machines were associated with varying levels of machine quality and residual, what is known as the residual voting rate. The residual voting rate is basically the measure of the percentage of ballots cast that are not counted in the final election turnout totals. And political scientists use the residual voting rate as a measure of the quality of election machines. It can be used as a measure for other purposes, but in the literature on the evaluation of election machines that are associated with high residual voting rates are associated with being of lower quality. Conversely, election advances such as DREs or optical scan machines are associated with lower residual voting rates, and those would be benchmarks or measures of higher quality voting machines. Now, in the 2000 election in Florida, millions of ballots went uncounted, not only in Florida but across the states. Basically, that brought to light great issues with the punch card voting machine mechanism and how that led to high residual voting rates in areas that relied on punch card voting machines. Now, basically, the federal government stepped in with Help America Vote Act in 2002, and by the time we get to the mid-2010s, punch card voting machines have been nearly entirely replaced by optical scan machines and DRE machines. A DRE machine is basically a computer interface by which you can cast a ballot. Now, there still is a small percentage of election jurisdictions that still rely on paper ballots and hand-counted ballots. However, this is not to say that optical scan machines and DREs are completely immune from residual voting rates from voters improperly using the voting machines. For example, research has been done that shows that undervotes or overvotes are sometimes a common problem with optical scan voting machines, and voter experience with the computers is sometimes a problem with the use of DREs. And voter interaction issues with those machines can cause higher residual voting rates. However, but the general consensus is that post-2000 election, the replacement of punch card voting machines with DREs and optical scan machines has resulted nationwide in the reduction of residual voting rates. However, there are still within this framework, there are historical and contemporary inequalities in the provision of election machines. With the exception of federal financial aid given to states through the Help America Vote Act to purchase election machines, most election machine funding comes exclusively from local and state governments. My expectation is that lower income counties will not be able to afford the same quality of election machines as higher income counties or higher income election jurisdictions. This is supported and corroborated by a lot of research. For instance, research following the 2000 election indicated that poor and racial minorities were more likely to reside in areas with problematic election equipment that made it more likely that their ballots would be rejected rather than ballots from more affluent or non-Hispanic white individuals. However, recent contemporary research has shown that DREs and optical scan machines have been shown to narrow residual voting gap rates between historically advantaged and disadvantaged groups. Still, given other inequalities that still exist in the contemporary American voting system, such as voter ID laws or African Americans or poor people being more likely to wait in longer voting lines than more advantaged demographic groups, a relevant question to ask is whether there continue to be disparities between more and less advantaged groups in terms of their access to quality election machines, and also the likelihood that these historically marginalized groups, meaning racial minorities and the poor, continue to have higher residual voting rates linked to modern voting machines. Now, my research question in this study is do inequalities in access to quality election machines persist? And do these disparities continue to result in higher residual voting rates in counties with higher levels of racial minorities and poor individuals? Now, my hypotheses are that because of disparities in funding for election machines across counties, two expectations are: one, that non-Hispanic, white, and more affluent counties will have more access to high-quality election machines, and also that these same counties will have lower residual voting rates linked to these technologies. Now, to evaluate these hypotheses, I rely on three data sources. I combine information from the Election Assistance Commission on basically how many people participated or attempted to participate in an election in a county election jurisdiction. I combine this with county level turnout data for the 2016 election from the US Atlas of Elections, basically to put together a residual voting rate measure. And basically, when I construct my residual voting rate measure, I follow conventional literature. I subtract total vote. From the total votes cast in election or attempted to be cast, I subtract total votes counted, and then I divide that by the total votes cast in election, and I multiply that by 100 to receive the residual voting rate for each county in the United States. And the average residual voting rate I constructed from the Election Assistance Commission was 1.67% on average for all counties in the United States, with a standard deviation of 1.83%. Now, again, my unit of analysis is American counties, since most election administration and election machine decisions takes place at the county level. The exception is Alaska, which is treated as a single election jurisdiction in this study. And my key dependent variable in this study is the county level residual voting rate. Now, my key independent variables include three binary election machine variables. One, hand-counted paper ballots, which represent the reference group in multivariate analyses in this study, and also optical scan ballots and DREs. Basically, these binary variables indicate whether or not an election jurisdiction has this type of election machine. Also, there's four demographic variables to capture the percentage of a county population that consists of African Americans, Hispanics, non-Hispanic whites, and per capita income. Additional controls include the percentage of the county population with a 4-year college degree or more, the median age of the county's population, and state fixed effects. I use two methods in this study. One is correlational measures to indicate whether or not different demographic groups have stronger correlations with given election machines or not. If my hypotheses about access to election machines is true, I would anticipate that non-Hispanic white individuals and more affluent, I should say non-Hispanic white neighborhoods or counties and more affluent counties would be more likely, they would have stronger correlations with DRE and optical scan machines than racial minority or low income counties. My multivariate analyses basically allow me to derive estimates about what level of residual voting rates are linked between different demographic groups at the county level and given levels of residual voting rates. And consistent with the literature, I weight my residual voting results by county level voter turnout. And basically in this study, I should point out, I'm focusing on the 2016 presidential election. Now, the first question I offer results on are which counties are more likely to have access to election machines. Now, these are the pairwise correlations I executed to answer this question. Now, regarding the question of whether lower versus higher income and non-Hispanic whites versus racial minority counties are more or less likely to have access to high-quality voting technologies, that is DREs and optical scan machines, the evidence is mixed. Areas with larger African American and Hispanic populations are more likely to have optical scan and DRE machines, while the inverse is true of areas with larger non-Hispanic white populations. DRE machines are associated with lower residual voting rates, so African Americans appear to have both access to and be advantaged by these machines. The only technology linked to higher residual voting rates is paper balloting, but only areas with higher non-Hispanic white populations are more likely to have these ballots. Areas with higher African American and Hispanic populations are less likely to use this technology. These findings suggest that racial minorities are more likely to be located in election jurisdictions with election machines less linked to residual voting, while non-Hispanic whites are more likely to be located in jurisdictions with the voting machine mechanism, paper ballots, more linked to residual voting. Now, the negative correlation between DRE and income suggests that individuals in lower per capita income areas are more likely to have access to DRE machines, but the positive correlation between optical scan and income suggests this voting machine type is more common in higher income areas. This finding makes sense insofar as higher income areas have more financial resources to devote to voting machine changes and maintenance, which also doubles as evidence that these areas have led recent American election jurisdiction movements away from DREs to optical scan machines. Now, the second part of my analyses, what are the impacts of these election machines on residual voting rates, varying the racial composition at the county level, and also varying per capita income as a proxy for income at the county level. Now, this first table shows you the multivariate regression results for the impact of voting machines and demographic factors on county level residual voting rates for African American and Hispanic American models. And basically in these models, I control for the percentage of the county population that consists of African Americans or Hispanics, and including my other control variables as well. We can revisit this slide during the Q&A session or part of this discussion. But two key results I want to point your eyes to is one, the negative and significant interaction effect between percent Black and optical scan machines, and also the negative relationship between percent Hispanic and optical scan machines at the county level. I should note, actually, this should be percent Black by DRE, the interaction effect, so that's a typo. But basically, I can to get at the substantive effects of these variables, I basically varied. I basically did marginal predictions, and I varied to capture the substantive effect of these interaction variables. I basically varied I varied the level of diversity at the county level from 0% African Americans to 86% African Americans, which is the highest concentration of African Americans at the county level. And I also ranged the Hispanic population at the county level from its minimum to maximum values. And I estimated what was the impact of having DREs or optical scan machines versus not having optical scan machines for those racial compositions at the county level. And what I found is that in counties with the highest level of African American population and DREs, the residual voting rates are expected to decrease by 1.2%. So DREs are particularly beneficial in counties with the highest level of African American populations. For Hispanics, in counties with optical scan machines, the residual vote rate is expected to decrease from 1.7% to 1.24%. And so basically, optical scan machines are particularly advantageous in densely populated Hispanic areas. Now, as a baseline, for purposes of comparison, I repeat the prior analyses, but instead in this table, in this analysis, I insert a variable for the percentage of a county's population that is represented by non-Hispanic whites. And what I find in this analysis is that that in counties with higher non-Hispanic white populations, there are higher residual voting rates linked to optical scan machines. Now, the last set of analyses looks at the impact of per capita income linked to election machines. Now, Regarding income, the results clearly show that optical scan machines have a more favorable relationship to residual voting rates in counties with higher per capita income. At higher levels of per capita income, counties with no optical scan machines are linked to high residual voting rates by nearly 2.5% than counties with optical scan machines. So optical scan machines appear to be particularly advantageous in higher income areas. So let's bring this to a close. What do I find? I find that counties with larger racial minority populations are not disadvantaged in terms of access to quality election machines, and actually have lower residual voting rates linked to election machines than counties with larger non-Hispanic white populations. But there's also evidence in this study that lower income counties are less likely to have access to certain types of election machines and to have higher residual voting rates than higher income counties. Now, a possible issue in this study has to do with the ecological fallacy, basically deriving individual level analyses, basically deriving individual level effects such as individual level African Americans or Hispanics or poor people, positing relationships between them and given forms of election machines and residual voting rates from my county level data. Basically, how I would address that issue is that I would like to further pursue this project and use individual level of analyses to do a robustness assessment of my study's findings. And I also would be interested in extending the model of this research to look at other marginalized groups linked to election machines, such as disabled individuals. Nonetheless, this study shows that gains have been made in terms of election machine quality since 2000, at least in high racial minority areas, but it points attention to the need to engage in further policy efforts to bring greater attention to election machine quality in lower income counties. And that brings me to close. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Michael. So the third presentation will be made by Travis Endicott from Ole Miss, and he has two co-authors, Leah Merivaki from Mississippi State and Julie Wronski from, again, Ole Miss, and their paper is titled, Can Voters Tell When Costs of Voting Are High? The Voter Experience in Mississippi.
Okay. Can everyone see the presentation?
We are good.
Sweet. All right. Well, I am Travis Endicott. It's my privilege to present our paper along with my co-authors, Julie Wronski and Leah Merivaki. Our paper is titled, Can Voters Tell When Costs of Voting Are High? The Voter Experience in Mississippi. All right. Let's try it again. There we go. All right. So the motivation for this project revolves around each of our interests in better understanding the voter experience and the political behaviors surrounding voting. We are especially interested in understanding voters' experiences in places that have high cost of voting. Living and working in the state of Mississippi gives all three of us the opportunity to conduct research on an understudied group of voters in a state that has some of the highest barriers to voting. Most national surveys or organizations who conduct exit polls often ignore Mississippi as not considered a battleground state, and the national results are more than likely awarded to the Republican Party well before the polls close. Given the suspect past of the state in regards to voting rights and the high institutional barriers to voting, our paper's first research question asks, do voters in Mississippi hold similar attitudes on their vote being counted accurately? Ultimately, the question of politics in Mississippi is also a racial question just begging to be addressed. We wanted to know if there was a difference among white and black voters on this issue of vote accuracy. Additionally, the fear surrounding alternative voting methods isn't a new phenomenon, but due to the current pandemic, the topic of convenience voting has been brought to the forefront, and this is an issue that is already in place in some states and others are implementing due to health risks. However, the state of Mississippi has been constantly resistant to change. Implementing convenience voting measures can potentially be very beneficial to increase turnout from minority groups who are often restricted on their voting access. Our second research question focuses on views towards alternative voting measures, specifically wondering if there are racial differences for support on different convenience voting measures. To understand the voter experience, we should understand what factors influence the voter prior to them casting their ballot. In the literature, it is referred to as the voter-centric approach. This means that there are different factors that influence how voters vote, including how election laws in states differ on this topic. Specifically, we see that when the costs of voting are high, the voter experience is negative. Research has shown that attitudes are formed prior to voting, which includes if, how, and when individuals plan to vote. Additionally, limitations on restrictions on voter registration or voting methods have been shown to decrease turnout by providing more obstacles that voters must overcome in order to cast their ballot. However, that does not mean that the voter experience cannot be influenced by election day factors, such as the time that you wait in line and the types of technology used in voting, which can also alter these voter-centric perceptions. Mississippi provides an interesting case on the voter experience due to its low performance measures and the restrictions placed on voters that create high institutional barriers. Mississippi isn't the only non-battleground state ignored by large survey firms or news networks. For example, the last AES had only 38 respondents from Mississippi. However, the racial demographics of the state make it a unique case study to research how the voter experience varies among residents of the state. Mississippi is particularly suited to inform our research questions due to the fact that Mississippi is a state with the highest concentration by percentage of overall state population of Black citizens. This allows us to test our assumptions on how race matters in regards to voter experience, and specifically how it matters in regards to beliefs of vote accuracy and support for convenience voting measures. The world as it exists now will be relying on alternative voting methods in order to accommodate voters who are unable to make it to the precinct. This has not happened without fierce political opposition. Clearly, this pandemic has disrupted normal voting habits, and time will tell as to how voters respond to these disruptions. Even though others have shown that alternative voting methods can potentially lower the cost of voting and increase turnout, what does support for these additional voting measures look like when the costs of voting are higher? For example, specifically in a state that has traditionally kept high barriers to voting access. As to how race plays a role in support of these measures, there has been inconsistent evidence on this topic, which leads to our hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, we theorize that white and Black voters will hold similar perceptions of vote accuracy when holding constant trust in government, education, voting ease, and party identity. We must understand that these are individuals who have already gone through the process of registering to vote, and are arriving at the precinct to cast their ballot. We assume that by having met these prerequisites already, they would have similarly higher faith in the accuracy of their votes while holding the other factors constant. Where we will see the differences in these opinions is when these attitudes are conditional upon one of the factors, trust in government, education, ease of voting, and party identity, which leads to our next hypothesis. Any differences in perception of vote accuracy between white and Black voters will be conditional on those factors. For example, those who have high trust in government, we should expect that there will be a spillover effect and lead to higher faith in their vote being counted accurately. Additionally, using previous theory, we put forth that Black voters will be less supportive of mail-in voting than white voters, all else remaining equal. We infer this due to the disruption to voting habits and how white voters will be better equipped to adjust their voting behavior to meet new demands required by new voting methods. In order to study these questions, we conducted exit poll surveys in the 2018 midterm elections and the 2019 gubernatorial elections in Mississippi. In 2018, a team of 4 researchers, which included 3 graduate students and 1 faculty member from the University of Mississippi, went to 8 precincts in 5 counties. Each interviewer was assigned 2 precincts, and we were able to get data on 7 of those 8. One interviewer was informed that the 30-foot distance he was allowed to be placed at, placed him right in the middle of a road, and no accommodations were made to overcome this obvious safety risk. So we only have data from 7 of the 8 that we originally set out to conduct exit polls at. The 2019 election contained 7 precincts in 2 counties, and there were more interviewers per precinct, consisting of graduate, undergraduate, and faculty members from the University of Mississippi and Mississippi State University. Since the precincts selected were selected due to the oversampling of Black voters, most precincts had low voter turnout in previous years. This meant that we lowered our methods of interviewing and attempting to survey every other voter. Both studies ended with identical samples of 200 respondents per year. Given the way that our data is structured, where voters are nested within both polling place and year, we utilize a hierarchical estimation strategy. We control for precinct and year fixed and random effects, allowing us to ensure that our estimations are not biased by the way that our data is clustered. Additionally, we center all variables at their means to account for the central tendency of our data instead of the variance at 0 values. So hypothesis 1 predicts that white and Black Mississippi voters will share similar perspectives on their votes, that their votes will be counted accurately. You can see this in the top left portion of figure 1, outlined in the red rectangle. Without peeling apart individual and contextual level heterogeneity, our findings show that this is in fact the case. Overall perceptions of accuracy remain quite high, with the mean vote accuracy for white voters at 0.84 and for Black voters is 0.83. Moving to a more rigorous examination of our data, we find that on average, race does not factor into confidence in votes being counted accurately. This supports H1 and holds while controlling for various voter level factors. We do report that increase in trust in government and perceived ease of voting had alternating effects on perceptions of vote accuracy. We also examine support by race of voting cost. It also may be the case, as H1A puts forth, that the factors like trust in government and the ease of voting may impact perceptions on vote accuracy, depending on the voter's race. What figure 3 shows is that when holding constant precinct and year effects and allowing the slopes of the key interaction variables to vary by precinct and year, there's inconsistent evidence for these conditional effects. There are, however, clear relationships between ease of voting process and vote accuracy among white voters, such that moving from the easiest to the most difficult process relates to a 19% decrease in vote accuracy beliefs, as seen in the bottom left panel and outlined in red. For white voters, the harder the voting process, the less they believe that their vote was counted accurately. The same, however, is not seen for Black voters. Additionally, there is rather weak support for the way that education impacts vote accuracy beliefs among Black voters. Though it should be noted that both groups, as mentioned before, had relatively high confidence in their vote accuracy. Again, for those who have already gone through the process of registering and showing up, we assume that they are working with the assumption that voting will not be a wasted effort. Turning our attention to our final hypothesis takes us back to figure 1. And as you can see in figure 1, there's a large difference by race in terms of support for mail-in voting. 35% of white voters support mail-in voting as compared to only 21% of Black voters. The same is also found when we control for precinct and year effects. A reasonable expectation is that voters would have more support, would be more supportive of alternative voting methods when the costs are high and the access is low. We find that the opposite is true for Black Mississippi voters. When the time it takes for them to travel to the polls is high, and when they perceive the voting process as more difficult, they're less likely to support mail-in voting. At the median travel time for Black voters, which is roughly 5 minutes, and for the longest travel time, 30 minutes, they are 22% and 37% respectively less likely to support mail-in voting measures. Even when controlling for precinct and year, there was never an instance of Black voters being more supportive of this measure than white voters. We also tested the effect of being more supportive of any additional voting measure, which includes mail-in voting, early voting, online voting, changing the election date, and cell phone voting. And figure 5 in our paper, but not displayed here, shows that this is in fact not the case. White and black voters held similar views on support for any of the additional voting measures, with one precinct showing that black voters were actually more supportive than their white counterparts. There seems to be something particular about voting by mail that does not appeal to black voters in Mississippi. As we theorize and find, black and white voters are equally confident that their votes will be counted accurately. Again, this finding should not be that surprising, given that the individuals that are in the sample are the individuals who took the time to register and make it to the precinct on election day to cast their ballot. In a state where the cost of voting and institutional barriers are already high, individuals who have already jumped through the hoops to participate should be more inclined to see their ballot as something that will be counted accurately. However, we find that there are some conditional factors that do moderate that support. Specifically, white voters who view the voting process as more difficult are less likely to hold their beliefs that their vote will be counted accurately. Lastly, our research examined the question of attitudes toward alternative voting measures among Mississippi voters. What we theorize and find is that black voters are less likely to support mail-in voting measures than do white voters. This presents a normative paradox for individuals hoping to increase voting access while managing voter expectations. Future research should further examine this interesting paradox and be cognizant about how increasing military representation on national surveys can afford researchers with more opportunities to study an understudied group of voters. Thank you.
All righty, thanks. Well, as a graduate of Yazoo City High School, gateway to the Mississippi Delta, you don't have to sell me on the idea that Mississippi is important to study. We'll get some comments now from Lisa to our presenters about their 3 papers. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you for the papers. They were very interesting. I've done something I've never done before, which is prepare slides and prepare comments. So I guess, this is a Zoom world. So, oops, I just stopped, didn't I? Okay, I'm not gonna go in the order of the program because I'm just throwing everything to the side today. I'm actually gonna go in the order of the papers. I'm just mixing it up. So I'm gonna discuss Travis, Julie, and Leah's paper first, the one that we just heard about, in terms of well, they called it cost of voting. Can voters tell when costs of voting are high? So I think that this is really interesting paper. Oh, I can't advance. And I agree with Michael. I actually really like your setup about Mississippi being an understudied state. And actually more than that, I like your setup about talking about states where it's hard to vote being studied, right? Because you talk a lot about how we see a lot of papers that are doing reforms that are trying to increase convenience and make it easier to vote, being published and being researched, but that we're not talking about as much the states that are hard to vote. So I liked the setup that you have. That said, I think that your front of the paper could be tightened up a lot and needs a lot more focus. When I was reading it, I was like, is this going to be a voter confidence paper? Is this about voter registration? Is it about voter ID? Is it about electoral integrity? Because you have all of these components kind of in the front of the paper. And so I think that you presented it here in a very concise way. And so maybe taking your outline for your talk and then looking at the front of your paper again and reorganizing it might be more effective. Oops, I skipped ahead. So reading this paper, I actually think that you could have 2 shorter papers, or you could think about maybe even publishing them as research notes, right? You have this very sort of differences in voter experience, and if you think that your ballot is accurate, and then you also have this question about support for vote by mail. And so again, in your presentation, it was a little more organized and it flowed a little bit better, but in the paper, I almost felt like you had sort of two different things that you were testing going on. You're using similar data, but I really think that you could break this out and have 2 different papers. And I have a little bit more to say about each of those in my comments. So one is about your support for vote by mail. You didn't talk about this in your presentation, But in your measure for support for any reforms, you take all of these very different types of reforms, including some which are like voting by your cell phone, changing election date, voting early, you know, having online voting, having mail-in ballots. I think those are really different types of reforms. So in your paper, if you actually did break this out and you looked at support for vote by mail, I think that you need to disentangle those different types of reforms, because I think that some of them are going to see much more support. And I actually, if you do that, even if you leave it in this paper, actually, I would like to see some descriptives, maybe a graph showing the differences in support between blacks and whites for those different types of reforms, because you put them all in this 0 to 1 variable, and you talk about how there's not support for reforms. But I think that, you might be washing out some of what's going on in combining all of these, because I think like cell phone voting is probably very low among everybody, but you also make a point about how blacks don't support vote by mail. And I wondered, do they support any of the reforms at a higher level than whites? Or are they just hesitant to reforms overall? Because thinking about the fight for voting rights, there might be a hesitancy to just change anything, saying like, look, we've been fighting to get access over all of these years. We know this game, right? But you throw a wrench in it and you change the game more, maybe we don't know how that is going to affect us. And so I just wonder if there's support at all for any of those reforms amongst blacks, which is why I think you could break that out into a bigger paper, right? Because you have more to talk about than just support for vote by mail. So that's one of my questions about that. One thing I want to talk about specifically, well, I want to talk about your difference in vote experience too, but I'll get to that. But one thing I want to talk about specifically is the cause of your ease of voting. So again, you put it on that 0-1, but you reversed it. So all of your other things, you go where the positive is the high end of the scale, right? So thinking about your trust in government, your positive is the high end of your scale, all of those kinds of things. But your ease of voting process, you put easy as 0 and hard, difficult as 1. So I think you need to flip that. And that's why you're seeing the negative side of the grid here, the graph here, right? The negative coefficient is because your easy voting is low, right? So I think you need to flip that. And then as you look at your next graph here, if you look at your confidence and vote accuracy, you have these really high, people think it's really easy to vote, and you had really high, your mean is 0.06, but that means people thought it was very easy, but it looks very different than your other graphs, right? Because you've got it flipped. So I think that that's something that you should do in the paper, and it will help. In terms of talking about your voting experience, one thing you said you didn't present in the presentation, but you do present in the paper. And I think that this is actually really what gets to the heart of your paper about accessibility is you looked at these precinct level experiences, and if people have found it difficult to vote in these precinct level experiences, and you find that where there's a precinct where people had a negative experience, they were much less likely to say obviously that voting was easy, but have confidence that their vote was counted correctly. And I think that ultimately when you're talking about vote accuracy in your paper, what I left with is like, are you really talking about accuracy, or are you really talking about accessibility, right? Like this voting is easy compared to hard, and how that affects people's support for different policies is really, I think, about that question. I have another note. Let's see. I also wondered in this figure 3 in the bottom right-hand corner, that negative effect that you're seeing from white Republicans to black Republicans, like how many black Republicans were actually in your polling data? Is that being driven by just a few very small number of people? But that was one of my questions. And so anyway, here's more on my accuracy versus accessibility, right? So my question about vote by mail, is it really about disenfranchisement? So are people thinking about that when you're asking them, do you want to vote by mail? Are they worried that their ballot won't be counted? Are they looking at Georgia and like Stacey Abrams elections and going like, no, I don't want to move to vote by mail, right? Or, like Dan Smith and then Yulia have presented before about whose ballots are more likely to be rejected. Well, maybe people are aware of those types of things. And so you kind of actually sort of allude to this on page 10 of your manuscript, where you say that that people might want to vote in person because they want to be able to ask questions about the poll workers. But I wonder if it's not necessarily about asking questions of the poll worker or receiving help on your ballot, but it's about that certainty of seeing that your ballot actually gets counted, right? That it actually gets fed into the machine, or you actually drop it in a ballot box if you have hand counting in Mississippi or whatever. I think that you can actually talk about this to a greater degree, that instead of, you know, just going out to the poll, really it's about that certainty that seeing your ballots accepted. And I actually thought about this with your result on time, on how you had that negative effect on, it took people longer to get to the poll. They were less likely to be supportive of vote by mail. I wonder if they feel like, look, I am dedicated to voting. I drove for 30 minutes to get here. I stood in line. I made sure my ballot was counted. Is there some weird like duty kind of thing about being you know, committed that is making people less likely to say they'd support vote by mail, right? That like voting takes this sort of commitment. I don't know. Or that it's really important to see in person, right? So we can think about people's historical experiences. I think that there's some other questions in your survey that you didn't use in the data that you could start to parse out these questions. So you have some questions about ease of registration. So if people think it's difficult to be able to register, or you have a question about wrong or right track of government, maybe if people think the government's on the wrong track, they're less likely to support additional changes to any sort of government system that might further work to disenfranchise them. And then you have one question about if people should have a say in government, which I think is sort of a proxy for an efficacy question. And so I think that you could look at that also and say like, well, if people, you know, I don't know, I think you could play around with that and see if it does anything. So I will email you other brief comments on the paper. Okay, on the Suttman-Lea paper, this is a poll worker paper, which I have seen lots of your work on poll workers, and so it's so weird that I can't see your guys' faces. Lots of your work on poll workers, and so it was, again, very interesting to hear about your poll worker observations and experiences. Oh, hey, Mara. So first of all, I think the premise is really interesting, and I agree. I think that poll workers really shape your election day experience. And just like going into any other business or location, if you have a bad poll worker experience, it can really sour your sort of overall view of how election day went and potentially your confidence, right? Additionally, I think studying provisional ballots is really important. And I think it's really hard, and I think that shows in your paper and actually even in your talk, right? Because thinking about provisional ballots are, of all the things poll workers do, it's one of the more complex processes that they actually have to do. They have to decide, you know, first of all, presumably there's been some effort made into trying to really figure out if that person should be voting or not. But also there's this sense that people get when they give a provisional ballot that they're being disenfranchised, they're not being allowed to vote. So for the poll worker, they know that a confrontation is likely to happen, right? So I think it's one of the sort of more complex things that they have to do. And I think it's interesting, and I'm glad you're studying it. You made a comment about descriptive representation, right, which you talk about in your paper. So I would suggest, so I noticed that one of our attendees mentioned the Street Level Bureaucrat book, which is very good. I would also suggest you could look at Contested Transformations, which came out in 2016, which was a Carol Hardy, Fanta, Christine Sierra, Pétillien book about descriptive representation at state and local levels of government. And so, and they have a huge data set of local election officials across the country. They have Black local election officials, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, local election, not local election officials, local officials. And so that could be a really good book to add to it. But I want to talk about some of the assumptions in your paper. And so one of the assumptions is that you have, and it feeds your hypothesis, right, that this co-ethnic or descriptive representation by poll workers will reduce the provisional number of ballots. And so you cite a lot of the literature, Barreto, I think Atkinson and Alvarez and Caravel, about co-ethnic representation, but there's also some mixed findings on this which don't get cited in the paper, right? Which is like, for example, Hispanic or Latino poll workers were more likely to ask for photo voter ID illegally of fellow, you know, co-ethnics, right? And so I think it's important to at least explore that and put it in your paper, that there are some mixed findings on this sort of co-ethnic experience at the polls. So another one, you make a comment about poll workers being temporary employees. And so thinking about that street level bureaucrat question again, right, that there's less opportunity for them to have these bureaucratic norms where they like dismiss people and stuff. But I wondered in your survey, can you control for the years of service that a poll worker has been working with Chicago elections? Because some of them work, 40 years, right? And so I think that those people who've been working more elections are more resistant to change because they're like, well, this is the way we've always done it. And so they want to keep doing it. And so even though they go to poll worker training and the local election officials tell them like, nope, this is a new policy, from being out doing observations that some of them are just like, oh, but we've been doing it this way for 10 elections, right? So I'm not going to change. So I think so maybe in your model, you can control for how long somebody has actually been a poll worker. Another one, so in your provisional ballots, you talk about looking at provisional ballots relative to the total number of voters, and that you expect that as the number of voters in a precinct or jurisdiction increases, that the provisional ballots will rise as well. I don't know if that assumption actually plays out. It might, right? But you might have different types of neighborhoods where people have lived there a long time, there's low levels of mobility, high rates of voter registration. So you might have more votes cast, but not very many provisionals, right? Like if you think about that, as opposed to like densely populated urban areas where you might have a lot of ballots cast, but a lot of provisionals as well, because you have a lot of movers and things, which you try to get at in your paper. But I think that's something you could probably talk a little bit about more. So I have an example here of like, this might actually get to sort of the quality of poll workers and how much effort they're putting in. So for example, if like in your data, you had 15 provisional ballots to get counted, but there were like only 15 issued in that whole precinct, that's 100%, that are being counted. So they maybe exhausted all possible ways that they could look for that voter in a voter file. Whereas say you have a precinct that has 150 issued, but only 15 of them get counted, right? That's 10% of them that are being counted. That's not very many. So I think that you have an interesting possibility here for like a quality or effort of the poll workers, but it could be time, right? What made me think of that is we had a precinct that had 800 something provisional ballots because they were all college students who lived outside the county and couldn't vote, but it wasn't the poll workers' fault, right? It was like, anyway. Okay, your data. You have about an 81% match on your poll workers, right? So 1 in 5 are missing. So my question was immediately like, are they missing at random? Or are those poll workers who you're not able to match? Is there something about them, right? So are they all brand new poll workers? Are they all really old poll workers? Is there anything about those poll workers that's making them missing? Or is there any way that you can try and look at the people who didn't match and see if you can figure out if there's any sort of patterns there? Also, you present the results of your places that matched 100%, so you can match all 100% of your poll workers, but then you throw out over half of your precincts, right? And so you have a bunch where you say you're missing only 1 poll worker. So if you have 8 out of 9, right, like why not present those? And you said that you didn't want to, be overconfident in those results, and I get that. So I was thinking, well, why not present those results side by side, right? Here's my precincts where 100% match, and some threshold. Here's where I had at least a 75% match. And you can see if there's differences in results between those. And if they're this similar, then I don't think there's anything to worry about. Okay, so I guess this is the big, hard question. So what do we do with this information that you present, right? If I'm a local election official and thinking about where you might publish this, I was thinking, you might think about going public admin journals or something like that with this, right? So if I'm a local election official, what do I do with this information? So you find essentially that in precincts where there's fewer lower Hispanic population, that each additional white poll worker decreases provisional ballots by like 3%. So is it like, also, okay, so 2 things. So as a local election official, do I go, oh, I should start, making sure I have white people in precincts? That doesn't seem like something that you probably want to say. And so, I know that these are hard because we had a similar finding with like older poll workers making more mistakes. And so you don't want to say like, don't hire old people, right? But so yeah, I think like, what is the takeaway message for this? And then also, I guess the bigger question for me thinking about you is, can you make this finding like more meaningful in the paper? So could you compare it to white poll workers in Black precincts, Black majority precincts, right? Do you see that again? Because basically what this shows is that up until you reach sort of a critical mass at like 96% of voters are Hispanic, you know, white poll workers have this positive effect, right? Which also, I like that in the paper you just call it an effect. But anyway, have this positive effect, right? But then once you have a majority Hispanic voters in a precinct, that positive effect of white poll workers goes away. So, well, I mean, and I guess, you know, at 22% it kind of goes away. It crosses the line, right? And so what about in precincts or voting locations where you have a majority of Black voters? So you could do a side-by-side comparison. Is there a difference between precincts that have Hispanic voters and Black voters and the effect of white poll workers in those precincts? So that could be a way that you make it, you know, more interesting. This is just a, like, I actually thought about taking it out and then I was like, no, I'll just leave it, whatever. Anyway, so for people watching, I'm not trying to be petty, I'm sorry. It's just conditioning from my mentor. So this, this is how your table appears in the paper, but the way it almost looks is that your total precincts, right? You have 72.4% and then you say 883. And I'm like, wait, is 883 72% of precincts? Now, I know from reading the paper that this is the total majority co-ethnic precincts, right? But it didn't make sense to me looking at the table. So I was like, you could just put like your N is 883 total precincts, and then, you know, 639 of them were co-ethnic majority precincts, right? So you could just make it easier for your reader who's just glancing at the table. So anyway. Okay, I think that was all my comments, but I have others that I'll email you too. So, and then finally, Michael, I don't have as many comments. I didn't type anything out, sorry. So these are, my comments are only responsive for the most part to your presentation and outline. So in your presentation, you started at the beginning talking about election machine problems and quality of election machines and the importance of quality machines. But then you start talking about, you know, that these new machines were ordered and there was no power and that poll workers weren't trained accurately on the machines. And you refer to that as election machine problems. However, is that really more of a quality of election officials problem, right? If you're not training poll workers, if you don't get locations that have enough power, I don't know that that can be blamed on the machines themselves or if that's a quality machine problem. So I think that's, if your paper has it framed that way, I would maybe rephrase that. You also made a comment about, you know, upgrading machine advances and machine technology and upgrading of machines, and that election officials wanted to, you know, make their jobs easier and stuff, but it's not, I think, just about that. I think we should acknowledge that it's required by states, of course. Some places you're required by law, and it varies how often you're required to update your equipment, but it's also about deterioration of equipment, right? And dropping counts, dropping votes. And so it's not just convenience, it's quality of results that you're getting. And so I think that's something important to acknowledge as well. In your correlations matrix, one thing I thought that you might want to add is the population or the size of the jurisdiction. So I didn't see that. So my guess is, and I don't know, I could be wrong, but that locations that are still hand counting ballots, yes, there might be a poverty question, but I think there must also be a population question, right? Because some place like LA County, for example, would never ever be able to hand count their ballots. But if I have, you know, a tiny county with 600 registered voters or something, I might be able to do that. And so the expense of upgrading my equipment might not be worth it. Does that mean that those voters are not getting a quality experience or that the quality of the vote is deteriorated? I don't know, but I think that you should look at either, you know, county size. I believe you're using counties in your thing. So I think that you should have a population variable in there. You made a comment in your presentation. So in table 2 of what I was sent, it shows that you have a negative effect for residual votes for Black times DRE machine, and then a negative for residual votes for percent Hispanic times optical scan machines. I don't know if you said that was a typo, and so it should be Black optical scan and Hispanic optical scan, so you could address that in comments, I guess. But if not, why do you think that optical scan DREs are working differently for the different populations? And then I guess that leads into another question is, you showed the effect for white voters, and you have that there's an increase as percent white and optical scan machines. You have that there's actually an increase in residual votes. And so why do you think that it's different for white voters than it is for people of color, right? For voters of color. And so like I said, I will get back to you on that. And then my last question, which I wanted to know, because I don't see it defined in your sort of setup, is, are you considering DRE machines and optical scan equal in quality? Because your paper is about quality machines. And so how are you defining quality, and are those things equal? And so those are my comments.
Thanks, Lisa. So we have just a few more minutes left for the authors to respond if they wish to Lisa's comments. I just want to add a couple of comments of my own. One for Mara. Here in Florida, we have very strong sunshine laws, and we have a requirement that poll workers must be registered voters. I wonder if you requested the lists of poll workers, if you'd get them, and if they would match up very well with the voter registration file. I know that when I did the pre-registration study over a decade ago now, I recall that Broward was really proud that they had put a high school student in every polling location, and they were helping with the tech deployment within each of the precincts. So they must have the data, and it's just a matter of whether or not they would be willing to give it up. So I encourage you to do that. And then, Michael, I was really thinking, building off of Lisa's comments, where we say, you sound like you're really interested in quality of voters' experiences. And I wonder if you might leverage some of what's going on now with the COVID situation on ballots that are being, ballot requests being accepted or rejected, or the ballots themselves that are being returned being accepted or rejected. There's a lot of variation we're seeing at the county level. It seems like it's an interesting question, and it gets at some of these variation questions about voters' experiences. So I encourage you to, it sounds like, again, that's part of your research agenda, is to really study voters' experiences and make sure people can participate fully. So I encourage you to think a little bit more broadly about other ways in which voters have their experiences. So with that, I did notice that all the presenters were very good about responding to the Q&A. So let's just have them respond to Lisa. If you have any further, as an audience member, Q&A questions, please put that into that Q&A chat dialogue. And if Mara, why don't we go in the order of the presentations? Mara, why don't you respond first?
Yeah, sure. Lisa, thank you so much for your comments, and apologies for the table. That was a last minute addition, and I'm not the best at data visualization. So no, I think the last comment you had, or one of the last comments, what do we do with this information? It's part of the reason why I'm wanting to be very careful about the claims that I make. I did, as I mentioned in the paper, run the models with the near complete precinct data, and I'll go back and double check on those. It's encouraging to hear that that is something that I could explore as I try to figure out ways to get these data in a more complete format. But yeah, I think that like side-by-side comparisons, even absent sort of statistical significance, would be really worthwhile moving forward. But yeah, that last comment, why does this matter? What do we do with it? I'll really have to think about that. So thank you.
Michael, if you wish to respond.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for the comments, Lisa. I do definitely think it's important to sharpen my argument, sharpen my front end. I also was thinking of the importance of including a control or greater acknowledgement of the role of poll workers and election machine experience. The Election Assistance Commission, the data set I use, includes information on poll workers per precinct. It's not as widely available as election machine data per election jurisdiction, but I definitely am interested in testing models with that control and with addressing that also in the literature and the framing of my argument. I also think it's important to acknowledge the legal requirements for upholding election machines, which I touch upon briefly in my paper, but I'll more fully flesh that out as I revise the paper. I also will, I think it's a good point to add a population or size of jurisdiction variable to my correlational matrix. I think that'll be useful. And you're correct about my typo that I pointed out earlier. DREs in my study are, they are uniquely beneficial for African Americans, or they have greater effects in benefiting African Americans in terms of reducing residual voting rates, whereas optical scans have more of an effect at reducing residual voting rates for I should say for counties with greater Hispanic American populations. I'm actually, you know, further developing that analysis too. I don't have an exact answer for those questions. Why are DREs more beneficial for African Americans or counties with more dense African American populations, etc. So I think that's an area of my findings that I will explore in more detail as I revise my write-up. How am I defining election machine quality? Well, I'm acting on the assumption I'm treating, I use 3 binary variables: paper ballots, optical scan machines, and DREs. And I make the assumption that when there's stronger correlations between, I'm making the assumption that DREs and optical scan machines are superior quality election machines. In my correlational matrix, I'm making the argument that when there's a stronger correlation between given demographic group compositions and election machines, that they have greater access to what are considered to be quality election machines. Now, I have considered that question myself. Is that a sufficient definition of quality? To more fully flesh that out, the data set I used for election machines, I think it's voter verified, but basically it's a data set on all the election jurisdictions in the United States, what type of election machine they use. And the literature I've consulted breaks apart each type of DRE machine, each type of optical scan apparatus or machine, and basically does a fine-tuned analysis of what differentiates different machines within the same, let's say, DRE category, etc., in terms of quality. And definitely, I do have the data to do a more fine-tuned analysis of what is considered a more high-quality DRE versus a less quality DRE. So thank you for your comments. I definitely think they'll help in improving the paper.
So we're just a little over, but hopefully I see, you know, many people are still in the audience. So if we give the last set of authors a chance to respond, Travis, and why don't you take the lead on that?
Okay, I'll try and be brief, but thank you, Lisa. Those are great comments in a way that we can try and focus the paper, make it a little bit more, potentially turn it into 2 papers. I like that idea as well. Specifically, the disentangling the different types of reforms. I think at one point I had created a table of that separated by race, but I will have to go back and try and find that, and then we can add it into the analysis. And the other point I wanted to address was the other questions to look at vote by mail, whether the ease of registration, the efficacy question, or the right and wrong track. I think those are wonderful ideas to try and help out make that argument a little bit better. And I don't know if Leah or Julie wanted to address anything.
Julie, do you want to jump in, or Yeah, well, so I definitely, first I want to thank Lisa for her feedback, and I really, especially your idea with like splitting this apart and really peeling apart sort of what is meant in our measures, like even thinking about voter accuracy. Yeah, I think that is such an important question to say, like, well, what do African Americans think about going on? And I noticed in some of the Q&A, people were talking about the notion that this is even more about disenfranchisement, and I think, and talking about survivor bias. And I think that's a really important point for us to really peel apart with these other types of methods that maybe for African American voters, the in-person showing up at the poll experience might be the most enfranchising experience for them. You know, and just given Mississippi's history and given so much distrust of government architecture here, I know, for example, it's extremely hard to even get people in Mississippi and some of these poor rural areas to even answer the census. So just knowing that we're seeing the survivor bias, and that among the people who do show up and do take this effort, that they're kind of they're very wary of in-person voting. I think it's important to really understand, is it in-person voting or is it any other method? And I really appreciate your comments about expanding out to those other types. And one thing I also want to talk about, you mentioned figure 5, and I think one thing that's really important to note is that not all precincts in Mississippi are created equal as well. And that was one thing we really tried to get at with this project. We had multiple precincts in college towns like Oxford and Starkville, but we also had people out in very poor rural areas that were predominantly Black or predominantly white. And I think maybe in the future we should go and sort of push forward on that sort of precinct level heterogeneity and figure out, well, why is it that in certain precincts Blacks are more reticent than others to have alternative voting? So overall, just thank you so much for your rich comments. I really appreciate it.
Leah?
Yeah, I don't want to take a lot of everyone's time. Yeah, of course, thank you, Lisa. Always to the point with your comments. Some of the things that we are trying to understand better is fleshing out these nuances in the voting process, and we want to make the argument as well that there were factors that drove people to the polls in the last elections that we studied. Right, there was the Cindy Hyde-Smith versus SB election with an African American candidate, and voters were very excited about that. So we try to see, you know, whether there's anything that can help us understand better in a high salience election, at least in the context of Mississippi. But I think you're right, and there are many. We need to flesh out better the driving mechanism to understand why we have these racial discrepancies. And of course, you know, our sample is limited, but as Julie and Travis said, that we want to be able to highlight this heterogeneity, if you will, in those precincts and how the dynamics might be different. So I think that your comments are going to help us figure it out a little bit better. And maybe you're right, maybe we do have 2 papers, which is always, you know, it's always the best comment to get, right? You have 2 papers, and then we have to figure out how to separate the 2.
Alrighty. Well, when I was at Caroline Tolbert's conference pre-Iowa, or for the Iowa caucus, I made a pitch that Mississippi ought to be the first state. And the Democrats have an interest in doing it, right? It's a diverse state. It's a smaller state, about the same size as Iowa in terms of its population. And you can start building democratic capacity within the state. So the work that you guys are doing in Mississippi is really important to start building that infrastructure, that civic infrastructure that's needed in a state that I think has been neglected quite a bit. All right, well, with that, we will wrap up today, and there's one more panel tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock. I put a link in the chat, so if you haven't already registered for it, please do so. And otherwise, thank you to all of our presenters for this panel, and Lisa for her excellent discussant comments, and even reformatting a table. Awesome.
Sorry.
Raising the bar.
Raising the bar for discussing comments. All right. So everybody else, have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow for our last panel.
Thank you.
Thanks. You can blame Lana Mara. She was such a nitpicky person about tables.
No. Noted. You presented it in the kindest of ways, so
Okay.
no worries. Bye, guys.
All right.
Take care.
Good to see you guys. Bye, Michael. Bye, Mike.